Awesome. So, I set the intention that tonight's reading accomplished the greatest and highest good for all. Okay, now let's go ahead and clear our space. We'll start with the water cleanse, which is going to be out of frame. So lavender essential oil blend. Okay, just take a few deep breaths here. Very good. Now, let's go ahead and light the incense. Reiki. Reiki power. Okay. That looks like it's our last one for this box. Okay, so I got a new incense coffin, as you can see. Alright, there we go. So we got some really great smoke here to further cleanse our space of negative, unwanted energy from the day. Like an energy shower. Okay. Awesome. Now let's go ahead and get right into our story. Guys know I like my symmetry, so let's just put it right here. Okay, there we go. Alright. Make sure you get that. Okay, good. Right, more and emerging from the perilous wilderness beheld the woman in whom he hoped to find embodied the warmth and cheerfulness of a home, set up as a type of sin before the people. Her matronly fame was trodden under all men's feet. Infamy was battling around her in the public marketplace. For her kindred should the tidings ever reach them, and for the companions of her unspotted life, there remained nothing but the contagion of her dishonor, which would not fail to be distributed in strict accordance and proportion with the intimacy and sacredness of their previous relationship. Then why, since the choice was with himself, should the individual whose connection with the fallen woman had been the most intimate and sacred of them all come forward to vindicate his claim to an inheritance so little desirable? He resolved not to be pilloried beside her on her pedestal of shame, unknown to all but Hester Prynne, and possessing the lock and key of her silence. He chose to withdraw his name from the roll of mankind, and as regarded his former ties and interests, to vanish out of life as completely as if he indeed lay at the bottom of the ocean, whither rumor had long ago consigned him. This purpose once effected, new interest would immediately spring up, and likewise a new purpose, dark, it is true, if not guilty, but a force enough to engage the full strength of his faculties. In pursuance of this resolve, he took up his real residence in the Puritan town, as Roger Chillingworth, without other introduction than the learning and intelligence of which he possessed more than a common measure, as his studies at a previous period of his life had made him extensively acquainted with the medical science of the day. It was as a physician that he presented himself, and as much was cordially received. Skillful men of the medical and chirurgical profession, which is most surgeons, were of rare occurrence in the colony. They seldom, it would appear, partook of the religious zeal that brought other immigrants across the Atlantic in their researches into the human frame, and maybe that the higher and more subtle faculties of such men were materialized, and that they lost the spiritual view of existence, and amid the intricacies of that wondrous mechanism which seemed to involve part enough to comprise all of life within itself. At all events, the health of the good town of Boston, so far as medicine had aught to do with it, had hitherto lain in the guardianship of an aged deacon and apothecary, whose piety and godly deportment were stronger testimonials in his favor than that he had ever produced in the shape of a diploma. The only surgeon was one who combined the occasional exercise of that noble art with the daily habitual flourish of a razor. To such a professional body, Roger Chillingworth was a brilliant acquisition. He soon manifested his familiarity with the ponderous and imposing machinery of the antique physique, in which every remedy contained a multitude of far-fetched and heterogeneous ingredients, as elaborately compounded as if the proposed result had been an elixir of life. In his native captivity, moreover, he had gained much knowledge of the properties of native herbs and roots, nor did he conceal from his patients that these medicines nature's food to the untutored had quite as large a share of his own confidence as the European pharmacopoeia which so many learned doctors had spent centuries in elaborating. This learned stranger was exemplary as regarded at least the outward forms of religious life, and early after his arrival had chosen for his spiritual guide the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale. The young divine, whose scholar-like renown still lived in Oxford, was considered by his more fervent admirers as little less than a heaven-ordained apostle, destined should he live and labor for the ordinary term of life, to do as great deeds for the now feeble New England Church as the early fathers had achieved for the infancy of the Christian kingdom. About this period, however, the health of Mr. Dimmesdale had evidently begun to fail. By those acquainted with his habits, paleness of the young minister's cheek was accounted for by his too earnest devotion to study, his scrupulous fulfillment of parochial duty, and more than all by the fasts and vigils of which he made a frequent practice in order to keep the grossness of this earthly state from clogging and obscuring his spiritual lamp. Some declared that if Mr. Dimsdale were really going to die, it was cause enough that the world was not worthy to be any longer trodden by his feet. He himself, on the other hand, with characteristic humility, avowed belief that if Providence should see it fit to remove him, it would be because of his own unworthiness to perform his simplest mission here on earth. With all this difference of opinion as to the cause of his decline, there could be no question of the fact. His form grew emaciated, his voice, though still rich and sweet, had a certain melancholy prophecy of decay in it. He was often observed on any slight alarm, or rather sudden accident, to put his hand over his heart with first a flush and then a boundless indicative of pain. Such was the young clergyman's condition, and so imminent the prospect that his dawning light would be extinguished all ultimately, when Roger Chillingworth made his advent to the town. His first entry on the scene, few people could tell whence, dropping down as it were out of the sky or starting from the nether earth, had an aspect of mystery which was easily heightened to the miraculous. He was now known to be a man of skill. It was observed that he gathered herbs and the blossoms of wildflowers and dug up roots and plucked off twigs from the forest trees like one acquainted with hidden virtues and what was valueless to common eyes. He was heard to speak of Sir Canon Digby and other famous men, whose scientific attainments were esteemed hardly less than supernatural, as having been his correspondents or associates. Why with such rank in the learned world had he come hither? What could he, whose sphere was in great cities, be seeking in the wilderness? In answer to this query, a rumor gained ground, and however absurd, was entertained by some very sensible people, that heaven had wrought an absolute miracle by transporting an eminent doctor of physic from a German university bodily through the air and setting him down at the door of Mr. Tyndale's study. Individuals of wiser faith, indeed, who knew that heaven promotes its purposes without aiming at the stage effect of what is called miraculous interposition, were inclined to see a providential hand in Roger Chillingworth's so opportune arrival. I'm going to take a quick moment to sip on my drink. I used to cut out the drinking sounds, and then one day I was like, why are you doing that? So anyway, okay. This idea was countenanced by the strong interest which the physician ever manifested in the young clergyman. He attached himself to him as a parishioner and sought to win a friendly regard and confidence from his naturally reserved sensibility. He expressed great alarm at his pastor's state of health, but was anxious to attempt the cure, and if early undertaken, seemed not despondent of a favorable result. The elders, the deacons, the motherly dames, and the young and fair maidens of Mr. Dimsdale's flock were alike importunate that he should make trial of the physician's frankly offered skill. So importunate means, in English here, insisting that he should seek the care of Dr. Chillingworth. Mr. Dimsdale gently repelled their entreaties. I need no medicine, said he. this pledge. He requested old Roger Chillingworth's professional advice. I could be well content that my labors and my sorrows and my sins and my pains should shortly end with me, and what is earthly of them be buried in my grave, and the spiritual go with me to my eternal state, rather than you should put your skill to the proof in my behalf. Ah, replied Roger Chillingworth, with that quietness which, whether imposed or natural, marked all his deportment. It is thus that a young clergyman is apt to speak. Youthful men, not having taken a deep root, give up their hold of life so easily, and saintly men who walk with God on earth would fain be a way to walk with him on the golden pavements of the New Jerusalem. Nay, rejoined the young minister, putting his hand to his heart with a flush of pain flittering over his brow. Were I worthier to walk there, I could be better content to toil here. Good men ever interpret themselves too meanly, said the physician. In this manner, the mysterious old Roger Chillingworth became the medical adviser of the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale, as not only the disease interested the physician, but he was strongly moved to look into the character and qualities of the patient. These two men, so different in age, came gradually to spend much time together, for the sake of the minister's health, and to enable the leech to gather plants with healing balm in them. They took long walks on the seashore or in the forest, mingling various talk with the splash and murmur of the waves and the sullen wind, and them among the treetops. Often likewise one was the guest of the other in his place of study and retirement. There was a fascination for the minister in the company of the man of science, in whom he organized an intellectual cultivation of no moderate depth or scope, together with the range and freedom of the ideas that he vainly looked for among the members of his own profession. In truth, he was startled, if not shocked, to find this attribute in the physician. Mr. Dimmesdale was a true priest, a true religionist, with a reverential sentiment largely developed, and an order of mind that impelled itself powerfully along the track of a creed and words passage continually deeper with the lapse of time. In no state of society would he have been what is called a man of liberal views. It would always be essential to his peace to feel the pressure of a faith about him, supporting while it confused him within its iron framework. So, like, describing religion as like a prison, there with the iron framework. Nonetheless, however, though, with a tremulous enjoyment did he feel the occasional relief of looking at the universe through the medium of another kind of intellect than those with which he habitually held converse. It was as if a window were thrown open, admitting a freer atmosphere into the close and stifled study, where his life was wasting itself away amid lamplight or obstructed day-beams and the musty fragrance, be it sensual or moral, that exhales from the books. But the air was too fresh and chill to be long breathed with comfort, so the minister and the physician with him withdrew again within the limits of what their church defined as orthodox. Thus Roger Chillingworth scrutinized his patient carefully, both as he saw him in his ordinary life, keeping an accustomed pathway in the range of thoughts familiar to him, and as he appeared, when thrown amidst other moral scenery, the novelty of which might call out something new to the surface of his character, he deemed it essential, it would seem, to know the man before attempting to do him good. Wherever there is a heart and intellect, the diseases of the physical frame are tinged with the peculiarities of these. And Arthur Dimmesdale thought and imagination were so active and sensibility so intense that the bodily infirmity would be likely to have its groundwork there. So Roger Chillingworth, the man of skill, the kind and friendly physician, strove to go deep into his patient's bosom, delving among his principles, prying into his recollections, and probing everything with a cautious touch, like a treasure seeker in a dark cavern. Few secrets can escape an investigator who has opportunity and license to undertake such a quest, and skill to follow it up. A man burdened with his secret should especially avoid the intimacy of his physician, if the latter disagreeably prominent characteristics of his own. If he had the power, which must be born with him, to bring his mind into such affinity with his patients that his last shall unawares have spoken what he imagines himself only to have thought, if such revelations to be received without tumult, and acknowledged not so often by uttered sympathy as by silence and inarticulate breath, and here and there a word to indicate that all is understood. If to these qualifications of a confidant be joined the advantages afforded by his recognized character as a physician, then at some inevitable moment will the soul of the sufferer be dissolved. And flow forth in a dark but transparent stream, bringing all its mysteries into the daylight. Roger Chillingworth possessed all or most of the attributes above enumerated. Nevertheless, time went on. A kind of intimacy, as we have said, grew up between these two cultivated minds, which had as wide a field as the whole sphere of human thought and study to meet upon. They discussed every topic of ethics and religion, and public affairs and private character. They talked much on both sides of matters that seemed personal to themselves, and yet no secret such as the physician fancied must exist there ever stole out of the minister's consciousness into his companion's ear. The latter had his suspicions, indeed, that even the nature of Mr. Dimmesdale's bodily disease had never fairly been revealed to him. It was a strange reserve. After a time, at a hint from Roger Chillingworth, the friends of Mr. Dimmesdale liked an arrangement by which the two were lodged in the same house, so that every ebb and flow of the minister's life tide might pass under the eye of his anxious and attached physician. There was much joy throughout the town when this greatly desirable object was attained. It was held to be the best possible measures for the young clergyman's welfare, unless indeed as often urged by such as felt authorized to do so. He had selected some of the many blooming damsels spiritually devoted to him to become his devoted wife. This latter step, however, there was no present prospect that Arthur Dimmesdale would be prevailed upon to take. He rejected all suggestions of the kind, as if priestly celibacy were one of his articles of a church discipline. Doomed by his own choice, therefore, as Mr. Dimmesdale so evidently was, to eat his unsavory morsel always at another's board, and endure the lifelong chill which must be his lot, to truly seemed that this sagacious, experienced, benevolent old physician with his concord of paternal and reverential love for the young pastor was the very man of all mankind to be constantly within reach of his voice. The new abode of the two friends was with a pious widow of good social rank who dwelt in the house, covering pretty nearly the site on which the venerable structure of King's Chapel had been built. It had the graveyard, originally Isaac Johnson's home field, on one side, and so well adapted to call upon serious reflections, suited to their respective employments in both minister and man of physic. The motherly care of the good widow assigned to Mr. Dimmesdale a front apartment with a sunny exposure and heavy window curtains to create a pink-dyed shadow when desirable. The walls were hung round with tapestry, to be from the goblin looms, and at all events representing the scriptural story of David and Bathsheba and Nathan the prophet in color still unfaded, but which made the fair woman of the scene almost as grimly and picturesque as the woe-denouncing seer. Here the pale clergyman piled up his library, rich with parchment-bound folios of the fathers and the lore of rabbis, and monkish erudition of which the Protestant divines, even while they vilified and decried that class of writers, were yet constrained often to avail themselves. On the other side of the house, old Roger Chillingworth arranged a study and laboratory, not such as a modern man of science would reckon even tolerably complete, but provided with a distilling apparatus and the means of compounding drugs and such commodiousness of situation, these two learned persons sat themselves down, each in his own domain, yet familiarly passing from one apartment to the other, and bestowing a mutual and not incurious inspection into one another's business. As the Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale, best discerning friends, as we have intimated, very reasonably imagined that the hand of Providence had done all this for the purpose, brought in so many public and domestic and secret prayers of restoring the young minister to health. But it must now be said, another portion of the community had latterly begun to take its own view of the relation betwixt Mr. Dimmesdale and the mysterious old physician. When an uninstructed multitude attempts to see with his eyes, it is exceedingly apt to be deceived. When, however, it forms its judgment, as it usually does, on the intuitions of its great and warm heart, the conclusions thus attained are often so profound and so unerring as to possess the character of truths supernaturally revealed. The people in the case of which we speak could justify its prejudice against Dr. Chillingworth by no fact or argument worthy of serious refutation. There was an aged handicraftsman, it is true, who had been a citizen of London at the period of Sir Thomas Overbury's murder, now some 30 years ago. He testified to having seen the physician under some other name, which the narrator of the story had now forgotten, in company with Dr. Foreman, the famous old conjurer. Who was implicated in the affair of Overbury. 2 or 3 individuals hinted that the man of skill, during his native captivity, had enlarged his medical attainments by joining in the incantations of the savage priests, who were universally acknowledged to be powerful enchanters, often performing seemingly miraculous cures by their skill in the black arts. A large number and many of these were persons of such sober sense and practical observation that their opinion would have been valuable in other matters. Affirmed that Roger Chillingworth's aspect had undergone a remarkable change while he had dwelt in town, and especially since his abode with Mr. Dimmesdale. At first his expression had been calm, meditative, scholarly. Now there was something ugly and evil in his face, which they had not previously noticed, and which grew still the more obvious to the sight the oftener they looked upon him. According to the vulgar idea, the fire in his laboratory had been brought from the lower regions and was fed with the infernal fuel. So as might be expected, his visage was getting sooty with the smoke. To sum up the matter, it grew to be a widely diffused opinion that Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale, like many other personages of especial sanctity in all ages of Christian world, was haunted either by Satan himself or Satan's emissary in the guise of old Roger Chillingworth. This diabolical agent had the divine permission for a season to burrow into the clergyman's intimacy and plot against his soul. No sensible man was confessed, could doubt on which side the victory would turn. The people looked with an unshaken hope to see the minister come forth out of the conflict, transfigured with the glory which he would unquestionably win. Meanwhile, nevertheless, it was sad to think of the perchance mortal agony for which he must struggle towards his triumph. Alas, to judge from the gloom and terror in the depths of the poor minister's eyes, the battle was a sure one, and the victories everything but secure. Okay. Chapter 10. The Legion is patient. Old Roger Chillingworth throughout life had been calm in temperament, kindly, though not of warm affections, but ever and in all his relations within the world a pure and upright man. He had begun an investigation, as he imagined, proceeded a terrible fascination, a kind of fierce though still calm necessity seized the old man with its gripe, and never set him free again until he had done all its bidding. He now dug into the poor clergyman's heart like a miner searching for gold, or rather like a sexton delving into a grave, possibly in quest of a jewel that had been buried on the dead man's bosom, but likely to find nothing save mortality and corruption. Alas for his own soul, if these were what he sought. Sometimes a light glimmered out of the physician's eyes, burning blue and ominous, like the reflection of a furnace. Or let us say, like one of those gleams of ghastly fire that darted from Bunyan's awful doorway in the hillside and quivered on the pilgrim's face. The soil where this dark miner was working had perchance shown indications that encouraged him. This man, said he, at one such moment, to himself, pure as they deem him, all spiritual as he seems, had inherited a strong animal nature from his father or his mother. Let us dig a little further into the direction of this vein. Then, after long search into the minister's dim interior and turning over many precious materials in the shape of high aspirations for the welfare of his race, warm love of souls, pure sentiments, natural piety strengthened by thought and study and illuminated by revelation, all of which invaluable gold was perhaps no better than rubbish to the seeker. He would turn back discouraged and begin his quest towards another point. He groped along as stealthily, with as cautious a thread and as wary an outlook as a thief entering a chamber where a man lies only half asleep, or it may be broad awake with purpose to steal the very treasure which this man guards as the apple of his eye. In spite of his premeditated carefulness, the floor would now and then creak. His garments would rustle, the shadow of his presence in a forbidden proximity would be thrown across its victim. In other words, Mr. Dimsdale, whose sensibility of nerve often produced the effect of spiritual intuition, would become vaguely aware that something inimical to his peace had thrust itself into relation with him. Inimical. I wonder what inimical means. Inimical means to be harmful, antagonistic, or opposed. It's just something. Alright. In other words, Mr. Dimsdale, whose sensibility of nerve often produced the effect of spiritual intuition, would become vaguely aware of something inimical to his peace that thrust itself into relation with him. But old Roger Chillingworth, too, had perceptions that were almost intuitive. And when the minister threw his startled eyes towards him, there the physician sat, his kind, watchful, sympathizing, but never intrusive friend. Yet Mr. Dimsdale would perhaps have seen this individual's character more perfectly if a certain morbidness to which cigars were liable had not rendered him suspicious of all mankind. Trusting no man as his friend, he could not recognize his enemy when the latter actually appeared. He therefore still kept a familiar intercourse with him, daily receiving the old physician in his study, or visiting the laboratory, and for recreation's sake watching the processes by which weeds were converted into drugs of potency. One day, leaning his forehead on his hand and his elbow on the sill of the open window that looked towards the graveyard, he talked with Roger Chillingworth while the old man was examining a bundle of unsightly plants, whereas he, with a look askance at them, with a look askance at them, for it was the clergyman's peculiarity that he so seldom nowadays looked straight forth at any object, whether human or laminate. Where, my kind direct doctor, did you gather those herbs with such a dark, flabby leaf? these black weeds have sprung up out of a buried heart to make manifest an unspoken crime. That, good sir, is but a fantasy of yours, replied the minister. There can be, if I forebode aright, no power short of the divine mercy to disclose whether by uttered words or by type of emblem the secrets that may be buried with the human heart. The heart, making itself guilty of much secrets, must perforce hold them until the day when all hidden things shall be revealed. Nor have I so read or interpreted Holy Writ as to understand that the disclosure of human thoughts and deeds then to be made is intended as a part of the retribution. That surely were a shallow view of it. No, these revelations, unless I greatly err, are meant merely to promote the intellectual satisfaction of all intelligent beings who will stand waiting on that day to see the dark problem of this life made plain. A knowledge in men's hearts will be needful to the completest solution of that problem, and I can see, moreover, that the hearts holding such miserable secrets as you speak of will yield them up at that last day, not with reluctance, but with the joy unutterable. Then why not reveal them here? Asked Roger Chillingworth, glancing quietly aside at the minister. Why should not the guilty ones soon reveal themselves of this unutterable solace? They mostly do, said the clergyman, gripping hard at his breast as if afflicted with an importunate throb of pain. Many a poor soul hath given its confidence to me, not only on the deathbed, but while strong in life and fair in reputation, and never after such an outpouring of utter relief have I witnessed in those sinful brethren, even as in one who at last draws free air after long stifling with his own palm-loaded breath. How can it be otherwise? A wretched man, we will say, of murder preferred to keep the dead corpse buried in his own heart rather than fling it forth at once and let the universe take care of it. Yet some men bury secrets thus, observes the composition. True, there are such men, answered Mr. Dimmesdale, but not to suggest more obvious reasons. It may be that they are kept silent by the very constitution of their nature, or can we not suppose it, guilty as they may be, retaining nevertheless a zeal for God's glory and man's welfare, they shrink from displaying themselves black and filthy in the view of men, because thenceforward no good can be achieved by them, no evil of the past be redeemed by better service. So their own unutterable torment they go about their fellow creatures, looking and pure as new fallen snow, with their hearts are all speckled and spotted with iniquity, of which they care not rid themselves. These men deceive themselves, said Roger Chillingworth with somewhat more emphasis than usual, and making a slight gesture with his forefinger. They fear to take up the shame that rightfully belongs to them. Their love for man, their zeal for God's service, these holy impulses may or may not coexist in their hearts with the evil inmates to which their guilt has imparted the door, and which must needs propagate a hellish breed within them. But if they seek to glorify God, let them not lift heavenward their unclean hands. If they would serve their fellow men, let them do it by making manifest of the power and reality of conscience, and constraining them to penitential self-abasement. Wouldst thou have me to believe, a wise and pious friend, that a false show can be better, can be more for God's glory or man's welfare than God's own truth? Trust me, such men deceive themselves. It may be so, said the young clergyman, indifferent as waiving a discussion that he considered irrelevant or unreasonable. He had a ready faculty, indeed, of escaping from any topic that agitated his too sensitive and nervous temperament. But now I would ask of my well-skilled physician whether in good sooth he deemed She now skipped irreverently from one grave to another until coming to the broad, flat memorial tombstone of a departed worthy, perhaps of Isaac Johnson himself. She began to dance upon it and replied to her mother's command and entreaty that she would be able decorously and little pearl paws to gather the prickly burrs from a tall burdock which grew beside the tomb. Taking a handful of these, she arranged them along the lines of the scarlet letter that decorated the maternal bosom, to which the burrs, as their nature was, tenaciously adhered. Esther did not put them off. Roger Chillingworth had, by this time, approached the window and smiled grimly down. There is no law, nor reverence for authority, no regard for human ordinances or opinion, right or wrong, except with that child's composition, remarked he as much to himself as to his companions. I saw her the other day bespatter the governor himself with water at the cattle trough in Spring Lane. What in heaven's name is she? Is the imp altogether evil? Hath she affections? Hath she any discovered principle of me? None, save the freedom of a broken law, answered Mr. Dimsdale in a quiet way, as if he had been discussing the point with himself. Whether capable of good, I know not. The child probably heard their voices from looking up to the window, with a bright but naughty smile of mirth and intelligence. She threw one of the prickly burrs at the Reverend Mr. Dimsdale. The sensitive clergyman shrunk with nervous dread from the little mosaic. Detecting his emotion, Pearl clapped her little hands in the most extravagant ecstasy. Mr. Brent likewise had involuntarily looked up, and all these four persons, old and young, regarded one another in silence till the child laughed aloud and shouted, "Come away, mother, come away, or yonder old black man will catch you. Yet he hath got the minister already. Come away, mother, or he will catch you." But he cannot catch little Pearl. So she drew her mother away, skipping, dancing, and frisking fantastically among the hillocks of the dead people, like a creature that had nothing in common with a bygone and buried generation, nor owned herself akin to it. It was as if she had been made afresh out of new elements, and must perforce be permitted to live her own life, and be a law unto herself, without her eccentricities being reckoned to her for a crime. There goes a woman named, resumed Roger Chillingworth after a pause, who here demerits what they may have none of that mystery of innocentness which seems so grievous to be born. Is Esther Prynne the less miserable than you that for that scarlet letter on her breast? I do verily believe it, answered the clergyman, nevertheless I cannot answer for her. There was a look of pain in her face which I would gladly have been spared the sight of, but still methinks it must needs be better for the sufferer to be free to show his pain, as this poor woman Esther is, than to cover it all up in his heart. There was another pause, and the physician began anew to examine and arrange the plans which he had gathered. "You inquired of me a little time agone," said he at length, "my judgment as touching your health." "I did," answered the clergyman, "and would gladly learn it. Speak frankly, and pray you me for life or death." "Freely then, and I plainly," said the physician, still busy with the plans, but plain, keeping a wary eye on Mr. Dimsdale. "The disorder is a strange one, not so much in itself, nor so really manifested, in so far, at least, as the symptoms have been laid open to my observation. Looking daily at me, my good sir, and watching the tokens of your aspect now for months gone by, I should deem you a man sore sick, it may be, yet not so sick, that an instructed and watchful physician might well hope to cure you. But I know not what to say. The disease is what I seem to know, yet know it not. You speak in riddles, learn to serve," said the pale minister, glancing aside out the hastily rising from the chair, you do not, I take it, in medicine for the soul. Thus the sickness continued Roger Chillingworth, going on in an unaltered tone without any interruption, but standing up and confronting the emaciated and white-cheeked minister with his low, dark, and misshapen figure, a sickness, a sore place, if we may so call it, in your spirit, hath immediately its appropriate manifestation in your bodily frame. Would you therefore that your physician heal the bodily evil? How may this be, unless you first lay open to him the wound of trouble in your soul? No, not to thee, not to an earthly physician, cried Mr. Dimsdale passionately, and turning his eyes full and bright and with a kind of fierceness and old Roger Jones. Not so, not to thee, but if it be the soul's disease, and I do commit myself to be one physician of the soul, he, if it stand with his good pleasure, can cure, or he can kill. Let him do with me as in his justice and wisdom he shall see good. But who art thou that meddlest in this matter, and dares thrust himself between the sufferer and his God? With a frantic gesture he rushed out of the room. It is as well to have made the steps of Roger Chillingworth to himself, looking after the minister with a grave smile. There's nothing lost. We shall be friends again anon. But see now, how passion takes hold upon this man, and hurrieth him out of himself, as with one passion, so with another. He hath done a wild thing. Ever now this pious master Dimsdale in the hot passion of his heart. It proved not difficult to re-establish the intimacy of the two companions on the same footing and in the same degree as heretofore. The young clergyman, after a few hours' privacy, was sensible that the disorder of his nerves had hurried him into an unseemly outbreak of temper, which there had been nothing in the physician's words to excuse or palliate. He marveled indeed at the violence with which he had thrust back the kind old man, but merely proffering the advice which it was his duty to bestow, and which the minister himself had expressly sought. With these remorseful feelings, he lost no time in making the humblest apologies, and besought his friend still to continue the care which, if not successful in restoring him to health, had in all probability been the means of prolonging his feeble existence to that hour. Roger Chillingworth readily assented, and went on with his medical supervision of the minister, doing his best for him in all good faith, but always waiting with patient's apartment at the close of a professional interview with a mysterious and puzzled smile upon his lips. This expression was invisible to Mr. Dimsdale's presence, but was strongly evident as the physician crossed the threshold. A rare case, he muttered. I must needs look deeper into it. A strange sympathy betwixt soul and body. Were it only for the art's sake, I must search this matter to the bottom. It came to pass, but not long after, the scene above ordered that Mr. Reverend Dimsdale at noonday, and entirely unawares, fell into a deep slumber, sitting in his chair with a large black-lettered volume open before him on the table. It must have been a work of vast ability in the somniferous school of literature. The profound depth of the minister's response was more remarkable, inasmuch as he was one of those persons who sleep entirely. His sleep ordinarily is as light as wakeful, and as easily scared away as a small bird walking on a twig. To such remoteness, however, that his spirit now withdrawn into itself, that he stirred not in his chair when Roger Chillingworth came into the room. The physician advanced directly in front of the patient, laid his hand upon his bosom, and thrust aside the vestment that hitherto had always covered him, even from the professional eye. Thus, indeed, Mr. Dimsdale shuddered and slightly stirred. After a brief pause, the physician turned away, but with what no wild wonder, joy, and horror, with what a ghastly rapture as it were too mighty to be expressed only by the eye and pictures, and therefore bursting forth through the whole loveliness of his figure, and making itself even riotously manifest by the extravagant gestures with which he threw up his arms towards the ceiling, and stamped his foot upon the floor. At a man's seen old Roger Chillingworth Chapter 11, The Interior of a Heart. After the incident last described, the intercourse between the clergyman and the physician, though externally the same, was really of another character than it had previously been. The intellect of Roger Chillingworth had now a sufficiently plain path before it. It was not indeed precisely that which he had laid out for himself to tread, calm, gentle, passionless as he appeared. There was yet, we fear, a quiet depth of malice hitherto, latent but active now, in this unfortunate old man, which led him to imagine a more intimate revenge than any mortal had ever wreaked upon an enemy. To make himself the one trusted friend to whom should be confided all the fear, the remorse, the agony, the ineffectual repentance, the backward rush of sinful thoughts expelled in vain. All that guilty sorrow hidden from the world, whose great heart would have pitied and forgiven, to be revealed to him, the pitiless, to him, the unforgiving. All that dark treasure to be lavished on the very man to whom nothing else can so adequately pay the debt of vengeance. The clergyman's shy and sensitive reserve had balked at this scheme. Roger Chillingworth, however, was inclined to be hardly, if at all, less satisfied with the aspect of affairs which Providence, using the avenger and his victim for his own purposes, and perchance pardoning where it seemed most to punish, had substituted for his black devices. A revelation he could almost say had been granted to him. It mattered little for his object, whether celestial or from what other region. By its aid, in all the subsequent relations betwixt him and Mr. Dimmesdale, not merely the external presence, but the very inmost soul of the latter seemed to be brought out before his eyes, so that he could see and comprehend its every movement. He became thenceforth not a spectator only, but a chief actor in the poor minister's interior world. He could play upon him as he chose. Would he arouse him with a throb of agony? The victim of forever on the rack, it needed only to know the spring that controlled the engine, and the physician knew it well. Would he startle him with sudden fear, as at the waving of a magician's wand uprose a grisly phantom, uprose 1,000 phantoms, in many shapes of death and more awful shame, all flocking round about the clergyman and pointing with their fingers at his breast. All this was accomplished with a subtlety so perfect that the minister, though he had constantly a dim perception of some evil influence watching over him, could never gain a knowledge of its actual nature. True, he looked doubtfully, fearfully, even at times with horror and the bitterness of hatred, at the deformed figure of the old physician. His gestures, his gait, his grizzled beard, his slightest and most indifferent acts, the very fashion of his garments were odious in the clergyman's sight, a token implicitly to be relied on of a deeper antipathy in the breast of the latter than he was willing to acknowledge to himself, for as it was impossible to assign a reason for such distrust and abhorrence, so Mr. Dimmesdale, conscious that the poison of one morbid spot was infecting his heart's entire substance, attributed all his presentiments to no other cause. He took himself to task for his bad sympathies in reference to Roger Chillingworth, disregarded the lesson that he should have drawn from them, and did his best to root them out. Unable to accomplish this, he nevertheless, as a matter of principle, continued his habits of social familiarity with the old man, and thus gave him constant opportunities for perfecting the purpose to which, poor forlorn creature that he was, and more wretched than his victim, the avenger had devoted himself. While thus offering under bodily disease, and gnawed and tortured by some black trouble of the soul, and given over to the machinations of his deadliest enemy, the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale had achieved a brilliant popularity in his sacred office. He won it indeed in great part by his sorrows, his intellectual gifts, his moral perceptions, the power of experiencing and communicating emotions, were kept in a state of preternatural activity by the prick and anguish of his daily life. His fame, though was still on its upward slope, already overshadowed by the soberer reputations of his fellow clergymen, eminent as several of them were. There were scholars among them who had spent more years in acquiring abstruse lore connected with the divine profession than Mr. Timsdale had lived. And who might well, therefore, be more profoundly versed in such solid and valuable attainments than their youthful brother. There were men, too, of a sturdier texture of mind than his, and endowed with a far greater share of shrewd, hard iron or granite understanding, which duly mingled with a fair proportion of doctrinal ingredient, constitutes a highly respectable and efficacious and unamiable variety of clerical species. There were others, again, true saintly fathers whose faculties had been elaborated by weary toil among their books. And by patient thought and etherealized moreover by spiritual communications with the better world, into which their purity of life had almost introduced these holy personages with their garments of mortality still clinging to them. All that they lacked was the gift that descended upon the chosen disciples at Pentecost, in tongues of flames, symbolizing, it would seem, not the power of speech in foreign and unknown languages, but that of addressing the whole human brotherhood in the heart's native language. These fathers, otherwise so apostolic, lacked heaven's last and rarest adaptations of their office, the tongue of flame. They would have vainly sought, had they ever dreamed of seeking to express the highest truths through the humblest medium of familiar words and images. Their voices came down afar and indistinctly from the upper heights of where they habitually dwelt. Not improbably, it was to this latter class of men that Mr. Timsdale, by many of his traits of character, naturally belonged. To the high mountain peaks of faith and sanctity he would have climbed, had not the tendency been thwarted by the burden, whatever it might be, of crime or anguish beneath which it was his doom to totter. It kept him down on a level with the lowest, and the man of ethereal attributes whose voice the angels might else have listened to and answered. But this very burden it was that gave him sympathy so intimate with the sinful brotherhood of mankind, so that his heart vibrated. In unison with theirs, and received their pain into itself, and sent its own throb of pain through 1,000 other hearts, in gushes of sad, persuasive eloquence, oftenest persuasive, but sometimes terrible. The people knew not the power that moved them thus. They deemed the young clergyman a miracle of holiness. They fancied him the mouthpiece of heaven's messages of wisdom and rebuke and love. In their eyes, the very ground on which he trod was sanctified. The virgins of his church rebel around him, the victims of a passion so imbued with religious sentiment that they imagined it to be all religion, and brought it openly in their white bosoms as their most acceptable sacrifice before the altar. The aged members of his flock, beholding Mr. Timsdale's frame so feeble, while they were themselves so rugged in their infirmity, believed that he would go heavenward before them, and enjoined it upon their children, that their old bones should be buried close to their young pastor's holy grave. And all this time, perchance, when poor Mr. Timsdale was thinking of his grave, he questioned with himself whether the grass would ever grow on it, because an accursed thing must be buried. It is inconceivable the agony with which this public veneration tortured him. It was his genuine impulse to adore the truth and to reckon all things shadow-like and utterly devoid of weight or value that had not its divine essence as the life within their life. Then, when was he of substance, or the dimmest of all shadows, he longed to speak out from his own pulpit at the full height of his voice and tell the people what he was. I whom you behold in said, I who ascend the sacred desk and turn my pale face heavenward, taking upon myself to hold communion in your behalf with the Most High Omniscience, I in whose daily life you discern the sanctity of Enoch, I whose footsteps, as you suppose, leave a gleam along my earthly track, whereby the pilgrims that shall come after me may be guided to the regions of the blessed. I who have laid the hand of baptism upon your children, I who have breathed the parting prayer over your dying friends, to whom the amen sounded faintly from a world which they had quitted, I, your pastor, whom you so reverence and trust, am utterly a pollution and a lie. More than once Mr. Timstill had gone into the pulpit with the purpose never to come down its steps until he should have spoken words like the above. More than once he had cleared his throat and drawn in the long, deep, and tremulous breath, which when sent forth again would have comforted with the black secret of his soul. More than once, nay, more than 100 times, he had actually spoken, but how? He had told his hearers that he was altogether a viler companion of the vilest, the worst of sinners, an abomination, a thing of unimaginable iniquity, and that the only wonder was that they did not see this wretched body shriveled up before their eyes by the burning wrath of the Almighty. Could there be plainer speech than this? Would not the people start up in their seats by a simultaneous impulse and tear him down out of the pulpit which he defiled? Not so indeed, they heard it all, and did but reverence him the more. They little guessed what dreadly purport lurked in those self-condemning words. The godly youth, said they among themselves, the saint on earth, alas, if he discerned such sin, if he discerned such sinfulness in his own white soul, what a horrid spectacle would he behold in thine or mine? The minister well knew, subtle but remorseful hypocrite, and that he was, the light in which his vague confession would be viewed. He had striven to put a cheat upon himself by making the avowal of a guilty conscience, but had gained only one more other sin, and a self-acknowledged shame, without the momentary relief of being self-deceived. He had spoken the very truth, and transformed it into the veriest falsehood, and yet by the constitution of his nature he loved the truth, and loathed the lie as few men ever did. Therefore, above all things else, he loathed his miserable self. His inward trouble drove him to practice more in accordance with the old corrupted faith of Rome than with the better light of the church in which he had been born and bred. In Mr. Timstill's secret closet under sock and key there was a bloody scourge. Oftentimes this Protestant and Puritan divine had glided on his own shoulders, laughing bitterly at himself the while, and smiting so much the more pitiless because of that bitter laugh. It was his custom too, as it had been of many other pious Puritans, to fast, not however like them, in order to purify the body and render it the fitter medium of celestial illumination, but rigorously, and until his knees trembled beneath them as an act of penance. He kept vigils likewise night after night, sometimes in utter darkness, sometimes with a glimmering lamp, and sometimes viewing his own face in a looking glass by the most powerful light which he could throw upon it. He thus typified the constant introspection wherewith he tortured, but could not purify himself. In these lengthened vigils his brain often reeled in visions seemed to flit before him, perhaps seen doubtfully, and by a faint light of their own in the remote dens of the chamber, or more vividly up and close behind him within the looking glass. Now it was a bred of diabolic shapes that grinned and mocked at the pale minister and beckoned him away with them. Now a group of shining angels who flew upward heavily as sorrow laden, but grew more ethereal as they rose. Now came the dear friends of his youth, and his white-bearded father, with a saint-like frown, and his mother turning her face away as she passed by, ghost of a mother, thinnest fantasy of a mother, methinks, that might yet have thrown a pitying glance towards her son. And now through the chamber which these spectral thoughts had made so ghastly glided Hester Prynne, leading along little Pearl in her scarlet garb, and pointing her forth there are around us, and which were met by heaven to the Spirit's joy and nutriment. To the untrue man, the whole universe is false. It is impalpable. It drinks to nothing within its grasp, and he himself, in so far as he shows himself in a false light, become a shadow, or indeed cease to exist. The only truth that continued to give Mr. Timsdale real existence on this earth was to give was the anguish of his inmost soul, and the undissembled expression of it in his aspect. Had he once found the power to smile and wear a face of gaiety, there would have been no such man on one of those ugly nights which we have faintly hinted at. But forborne to picture forth, the minister started from his chair. A new thought had struck him. There might be a moment's peace in it, attiring himself with as much care as if it had been for public worship, and precisely in the same manner he stole softly down the staircase until the door and issued forth. Undid the door and issued forth. Chapter 12. The Minister's Vigil. Walking in the shadow of a dream, as it were, and perhaps actually under the influence of a species of somnambulism, Mr. Timsdale reached the spot whence now so long since Esther Prynne had lived through her first hours of public ignominy. The same platform or scaffold, black and weather-stained with the storm or sunshine of 7 long years, and footboard too with the threat of many culprits who had since ascended it. It remained standing beneath the balcony of the meeting house. The minister went up the steps. It was an obscure night of early May. An unvaried pall of cloud muffled the whole expanse of sky from zenith to horizon. If the same multitude which had stood as eyewitnesses while Esther Prynne sustained her punishment could now have been summoned forth, they would have discerned no face above the platform, nor hardly the outline of a human shape in the dark gray of the midnight. But the town was all asleep, and there was no peril of discovery. The minister might stand there, if it so pleased him, until morning should redden in the east, without other risk than that the dank and chill night air would creep into its brain and stiffen his joints with rheumatism and clog his throat with catarrh and cough, thereby defrauding the expectant audience of tomorrow's prayer. And sermon. No one could see how to save the ever-wakeful one which had seen him in his closet, wielding the bloody scourge. Why then had he come hither? Was it but the mockery of penitence, a mockery indeed, but in which his soul trifled with itself, a mockery at which angels blushed and wept, while fiends rejoiced with cheering laughter? He had been driven hither by the impulse of the remorse which dogged him everywhere, and whose own sister, and closely linked companion, was the cowardice which invariably drew him back with her tremulous gripe, just when the other impulse had hurried him to the verge of a disclosure. Poor miserable man, what right had infirmity like his, to burden itself with crime? Crime is for the iron-nerved who have their choice either to endure it, or, if it press too hard, to exert their fierce and savage strength for a good purpose and fling it off at once. This feeble and most sensitive of spirits could do neither, yet continually did one thing or another, which intertwined in the same inextricable, not the agony of heaven-defying guilt and vain repentance. And thus, while standing on the scaffold in this vain show of expiation, Mr. Timsdale was overcome with a great horror of mind, as if the universe were gazing at a scarlet token on his naked breast, right over his heart. On that spot, in very truth, there was, and there had long been, the gnawing and poisonous tooth of bodily pain. Without any effort or of his will, or power to restrain himself, he shrieked aloud, and outcried that one pealing through the night, and was beaten back from one house to another, and reverberated from the hills in the background, as if a company of devils detecting so much misery and terror fire in it and made a plaything of the sound and were beating it to and fro. "It is done," muttered the minister, covering his face with his hands. "The whole town will awake and hurry forth and find me here." But it was not so. The shriek had perhaps sounded with a far greater power to his own startled ears than it actually possessed. The town did not awake, or if it did, the drowsy slumberers mistook the cry either for something frightful in a dream, or for the noise of witches, whose voices at that period were often heard to pass over the settlements or lonely cottages as they rode with Satan through the air. The clergyman, therefore, hearing no symptoms of disturbance, uncovered his eyes and looked about him at one of the chamber windows of Governor Bellingham's mansion, which stood at some distance on the line of another street. He beheld the appearance of the old magistrate himself, with a lamp in his hand, a white nightcap on his head, and a long white gown enveloping his figure. He looked like a ghost evoked unreasonably from the grave. The cry had evidently startled him, and at another window of the same house, moreover, appeared old Mistress Evans, the governor's sister, also with the lamp, which, even thus far off, revealed the expression of her sour and discontented face. She thrust forth her head from the lattice and looked anxiously upward. Beyond the shadow of a doubt, this venerable witch lady had heard Mr. Timsdale's outcry, and interpreted it with its multitudinous echoes and reverberations as the clamor of the fiends and night hags with whom she was well known to make excursions into the forest. Detecting the gleam of Governor Bellingham's lamp, this old lady quickly extinguished her own and vanished. Possibly she went among the clouds. Thus, when the minister saw nothing further of her motions, the magistrate left her a weary observation of the darkness, into which, nevertheless, he could see but little further than he might into a millstone, retired from the window. The minister grew comparatively calm. His eyes, however, were soon greeted by a little glimmering light, which at first, a long way off, was approaching up the street in recognition on near a post, and near a latticed window pane, and there, with its full trough of water, and here again an arched door overlooked, with an iron knocker and a rough bell on the doorstep. The Reverend Mr. Timsdale made all the minute particulars, even while firmly convinced that the jam of his existence was stealing onward in the footsteps which he now heard, and that the gleam of the lantern would fall upon him in a few moments more, and reveal his long-hidden secret. As the light drew near, he held with its illuminated circle his brother clergyman, or to speak more accurately, his professional father, as well as highly valued friend, the Reverend Mr. Watson, who, as Mr. Timsdale now conjectured, had been praying at the bedside of some dying man. And so he had. The good old minister came firstly from the death chamber of Governor Winthrop, who had passed from the earth to heaven within that very hour, and now surrounded like the saint-like personages of olden times, with a radiant halo that glorified him amid this gloomy night of sin, as if the departed governor had left him an inheritance of his glory, or as if he had caught upon himself the distant shine of the celestial city, while looking to see the triumphal pilgrim pass within its gates. Now, in short, good Father Wilson was moving homeward, aiding his footsteps with a lighted lantern. The glimmer of this luminary suggested the above conceits to Mr. Timsdale, who smiled, nay, almost laughed at them, and then wondered if he were going mad. As the Reverend Mr. Wilson passed beside the scaffold, closely muffling his Geneva cloak about him with one arm, and holding the lantern before his breast with the other, the minister could hardly restrain himself from speaking. "A good evening to you, venerable Father Wilson. Come up hither, I pray you, and pass a pleasant hour with me." Good heavens, had Mr. Timsdale actually spoken? For one instant he believed that these words had passed his lips. discovered by the faintness which came over him that the last few moments had been a crisis of terrible anxiety, although his mind had made an involuntary effort to relieve itself by a kind of lurid playfulness. Shortly afterwards, the grisly sense of the humorous again stole in among the solemn phantoms of his thought. He felt his limbs growing stiff with the unaccustomed chilliness of the night and doubted whether he should be able to descend the steps of the scaffold. Morning would break and find him there. The neighborhood would begin to rouse itself, the earliest riser coming forth. In the dim twilight would perceive a vaguely defined figure aloft on the place of shame, and half-crazed betwixt alarm and curiosity, would go knocking from door to door, summoning all the people to behold the ghost as he needs must think of it of some defunct transgressor. A dusky tumult would flap its wings from one house to another. Then, the morning light still waxing stronger, old patriarchs would rise up in great haste, each in his flannel gown and matronly dames, without pausing to put off their night gear. The whole tribe of decorous personages who had never heretofore had been seen with a single hair of their heads awry would start into public view with the disorder of a nightmare in their aspects. Old Governor Bellingham would come grimly forth with the King James ruff fastened askew, and Mistress Hibbins with some twigs of the forest clinging to her skirts, and looking sourer than ever, as having hardly got a wink of sleep after her night ride, and good Father Wilson too, spending half the night at a deathbed, and liking ill to be disturbed thus early out of his dreams about the glorified saints. Hither likewise would come to the elders and deacons of Mr. Dimsdale's church, and the young of the virgins who idolized their minister, and had made a shrine for him in their white bosoms, which now, by the by, in their hurry and confusion, they would scantily have given themselves time to cover with their kerchiefs. All people, in a word, would come stumbling over their thresholds and turning up their amazed and horror-stricken visages around the scaffold. Oh, what would they discern there with the red eastern light upon his brow? Whom but the Reverend Arthur Dimsdale, half frozen to death, overwhelmed with shame, and standing where Hester Prynne had stood, carried away by the grotesque horror of this picture, the minister, unawares and to his own infinite alarm, burst into a great peal of laughter. It was immediately responded to by a light, airy, childish laugh, in which, with a thrill of the heart, but he knew not whether of exquisite pain or pleasure as acute, he recognized the tones of little Pearl. Pearl, little Pearl, cried he after a moment's pause, then suppressing his voice, Hester Prynne, are you there? Yes, it is Hester Prynne, she replied in a tone of surprise, and the minister heard her footsteps approaching from the sidewalk along which she had been passing. It is I and my little Pearl. Whence come you, Hester? Said the minister. What sent you hither? I have been watching at a deathbed, answered Hester Prynne, at Governor Winthrop's deathbed, and have taken the measure for a robe, and am now going homeward to my dwelling. Come up hither, Hester, thou and little Pearl, said the Reverend Dimsdale. Ye have both been here before, but I was not with you. Come hither once again, and we will stand all three together. She silently ascended the steps and stood on the platform, holding little Pearl by the hand. The minister felt for the child's other hand and took it. The moment that he did so, there came what seemed a tumultuous rush of new life, other life than his own, pouring like a torrent into his heart, and hurried. Through all his veins, as if the mother and the child were communicating their vital warmth to his half-torpid system. The three formed an electric chain, minister whispered little Pearl. What wouldst thou say, child? Asked Mr. Dimmesdale. Wilt thou stand here with mother and me tomorrow noontide? Inquired Pearl. Nay, not so, my little Pearl, answered the minister, for with the new energy of the moment, all the dread of public exposure that had so long been the anguish of his life had returned upon him, and he was already trembling at the conjunction in which, with a strange joy, nevertheless, he now found himself. Not so, my child, I shall indeed stand with thy mother and thee one other day, but not tomorrow. Pearl laughed and attempted to pull away her hand, but the minister held it fast. A moment longer, my child, said he. But wilt thou promise? Asked Pearl, to take my hand and mother's hand to tomorrow noontide. Not then, Pearl, said the minister, but another time. And what other time? Persisted the child. At the great judgment day, whispered the minister, and strangely enough the sense that he was a professional teacher of the truth impelled him to answer the child so. Then and there, before the judgment seat, thy mother and thou and I must stand together, but the daylight of this world shall not see our meeting. But Pearl laughed again. But before Mr. Dimmesdale had done speaking, a light gleamed far and wide over all the muffled sky. It was doubtless caused by one of those meteors which the night watcher may so often observe, burning out to waste in the vacant regions of the atmosphere. So powerful was its radiance that it thoroughly illuminated the dense medium of cloud betwixt the sky and earth. The great vault brightened like the dome of an immense lamp. It showed the familiar scene of the street with the distinctness of midday, but also with the awfulness that is always imparted to familiar objects by an unaccustomed light. The wooden houses with their jutting stories and quaint gable peaks, the doorsteps and thresholds with the early grass springing up about them, the garden plots black with the freshly turned earth, the wheel track little worn, and even in the marketplace margined with green on either side, all were visible, but with a singularity of aspect that seemed to give another moral interpretation to the things of this world than they had ever borne before. And they stood there, and there stood the minister with his hand over his heart, and Esther Prynne with the embroidered letter glimmering on her bosom, and little Pearl herself assembled, and the connecting link between those two. They stood in the noon of that strange and solemn splendor, as if it were the light that is to reveal all secrets, and the daybreak that shall unite all who belong to one another. There was witchcraft in little Pearl's eyes, and on her face, as she glanced upward at the minister, wore that naughty smile which made its expression frequently so elfish. She withdrew her hand from Mr. Dimmesdale's, and I pointed across the street, but he clasped both his hands over his breast and cast his eyes towards the zenith. Nothing more common in those days than to interpret all meteoric appearances and other natural phenomena that occurred with less regularity than the rise and set of the sun and moon, as so many revelations from a supernatural source. Thus, a blazing spear, a word of flame, a bow, or a sheaf of airborne arrows seen in the midnight sky prefigured native warfare. Nothing was more common in those days than to interpret all meteoric appearances and other natural phenomena that occurred with less regularity than the rise and set of the sun and moon, as so many revelations from a supernatural source. Thus, a blazing spear, a sword of flame, a bow, or a sheaf of arrows, seen in the midnight sky, prefigured native warfare. Pestilence was known to have been foreboded by a shower of crimson light. We doubt whether any marked event for good or evil ever befell New England from its settlement down to the Revolutionary times, of which the inhabitants had not seen previously warned by some spectacle of this nature. Not seldom it had been by multitudes. Oftener, however, its credibility rised on the faith of some lonely eyewitness who beheld the wonder through the collared, magnifying and distorting medium in his imagination, and shaped it more distinctly in his afterthought at one with our forefathers as betokening that their infant commonwealth was under a celestial guardianship of peculiar intimacy and strictness. But what shall we say when an individual discovers a revelation addressed to himself alone on the same vast sheet of record? In such a case, it could only be the symptom of a highly disordered mental state when a man, rendered morbidly self-contemplative by a long, intense, and secret pain, had extended his egotism over the whole world, over the whole expanse of nature, until the firmament itself should appear no more than a fitting page for his soul's history and fate. We impute it, therefore, solely to the disease in his own eye and heart, that the minister, looking upward to the zenith, beheld there the appearance of an immense letter, the letter A, marked out in lines of dull red light. Not but the meteor may have shown itself at that point, burning duskily through a veil of cloud, but with no such shape as his guilty imagination gave it, or at least with so little definiteness that another's guilt might have seen another symbol on it. There was a singular circumstance that characterized Mr. Timstill's psychological state at this moment. All the time that he gazed upward to the zenith, he was nevertheless perfectly aware that little Pearl was pointing her finger towards old Roger Chillingworth, who stood at no great distance from the scaffold. The minister appeared to see him with the same glance that discerned the miraculous letter. To his features, as to all other objects, the meteoric light imparted a new expression, or it might be well that the physician was not careful then, as at all other times, to hide the malevolence with which he looked upon his victim. Certainly, if the meteor kindled up the sky and disclosed the earth with an awfulness that admonished Esther Prynne with the clergyman of the day of judgment, then might Roger Chillingworth have passed with them for the arch-fiend, standing there with a smile and scowl to claim his own. So vivid was the expression, or so intense the minister's perception of it, that it seemed still to remain painted on the darkness after the meteor had vanished, with an effect as if the street and all things else or more were once annihilated. Who was that man? Hester gasped Mr. Timstill. Overcome with terror, I shiver at him. Dost thou know the man? I hate him, Esther. She remembered her oath and was silent. I tell thee, my soul shivers at him. Muttered the minister again. Who is he? Who is he? Canst thou do nothing for me? I have a nameless horror of the man. Minister, said little Pearl, I can tell thee who he is. Quickly then, child, said the minister, bending his ear close to her lips, quickly and as low as thou canst whisper. Pearl mumbled something into his ear that sounded indeed like human language, but was only such a gibberish that, as child may be heard, amusing themselves with by the hour together. At all events, if involved in any secret information in regard to old Roger Chillingworth, it was in a tongue unknown to the erudite clergyman, and did but increase the bewilderment of his mind. The elfish child then laughed aloud. Dost thou mock me now? Said the minister. Thou wast not bold, thou wast not true, answered the child. Thou wast not promised to take my hand and mother's hand tomorrow noontide. Worthy sir, answered the physician, who had now advanced to the foot of the platform, by his master Timstill can bespeak you. Well, indeed, we men of study, whose heads are in our books, have need to be straightly looked after. We dream in our waking moments and walk in our sleep. Come, good sir, and my dear friend, I pray, let me lead you home. How knowest thou that I was here? Asked the minister fearfully. Verily, I did in faith, answered Roger Chillingworth. I knew nothing of the matter. I had spent the better part of the night at the bedside of the worshipful Governor Winthrop, doing what my poor skill might to give him ease. He going home to a better world. I likewise was on my way homeward when this strange light shone out. Come with me, I beseech you, reverend sir, else you will be poorly able to do Sabbath duty tomorrow. See now how they trouble the brain, these books. And these books you should study less, good sir, and take a little pastime, or these night whimsies will grow upon you. with you, said Mr. Dimmesdale, with a chill despondency like one awakening, all nevertheless from an ugly dream. He yielded himself to the physician and was led away. The next day, however, during the Sabbath, he preached a discourse which was held to be the richest and most powerful and the most replete with heavenly influences that had ever proceeded from his lips. Souls, it is said, more souls than one were brought to the truth by the efficacy of that sermon, and vowed within themselves to cherish a holy gratitude towards Mr. Dimmesdale throughout the long hereafter. But as he came down the pulpit steps, the grey-bearded sexton met him, holding up a black glove which the minister recognized as his own. It was found, said the sexton, this morning on the scaffold where evildoers are set up to do public shame. Satan dropped it there. I take it intending a scurrilous just against you, reverence. But indeed, he was blind and foolish, as he ever and always is. A Puritan needs no glove to cover it. Thank you, my good friend, said the minister gravely, but startled at heart, for so confused was his remembrance that he had almost brought himself to look at the events of the past night as missionary. Yet, yes, it seems to be my glove indeed, and since Satan saw it fit to steal it, your reverence must needs handle him without gloves. Henceforward, remarked the old sexton, grimly smiling, but did your reverence hear of the portent that was seen last night? A great red letter in the sky, the letter A, which we interpret to stand for angel, for as our good Governor Winthrop was made an angel this past night, it was doubtless held fit that there should be some notice thereof. No, answered the minister, I had not heard of it. Chapter 12. Another View of Esther. In her late singular interview with Mr. Dimmesdale, Esther Prynne was shocked at the condition to which she found the clergyman reduced. His nerves seemed absolutely destroyed. His moral force was abased into more than childish weakness. It groveled helpless on the ground, even while his intellectual faculties retained their pristine strength, or had perhaps acquired a morbid energy, which disease only could have given them, with their knowledge of a train of circumstances hidden from all others. She could readily infer that besides the legitimate action of his own conscience, a terrible machinery had been brought to bear, and was still operating on Mr. Dimmesdale's well-being and repose. Knowing what this poor fallen man was been, her whole soul was moved by the shuddering terror with which he had appealed to her, the outcast woman, for support against his instinctively discovered enemy. So she decided, moreover, that he had a right to her utmost aid. Little accustomed in her long seclusion from society to measure her ideas of right and wrong by any standard external to herself, Esther saw, or seemed to see, that there lay a responsibility upon her in reference to the clergyman which she owed to no other, nor the whole world besides. The links that united her to the rest of humankind, links of flowers or silk or gold or whatever material, had all been broken. Here was the iron link of the mutual crime, which neither he nor she could break. Like all other ties, it brought along with it its obligations. Esther Prynne did not now occupy precisely the same position in which we beheld her during the earliest periods of her ignominy. Years had come and gone, pearl same time interferes neither with public nor individual interests and convenience. A species of general regard had ultimately grown up in reference to Hester Prynne. It is to the credit of human nature that, except where its selfishness is brought into play, it loves more readily than it hates. Hatred, by a gradual and quiet process, will even be transformed to love unless the change be impeded by a continually new irritation of the original feeling of hostility. In this matter of Hester Prynne, there was neither irritation nor irksomeness. She neither battled with the public nor submitted uncomplainingly to it to its worst usage. She made no claim upon it in requital for what she suffered. She did not weigh upon its sympathies. Then also the blameless purity of her life during all these years in which she had been set apart to infamy was reckoned largely in her favor. With no hope and seemingly no wish of gaining anything, it could only be a genuine regard for virtue that had brought back the poor wanderer to its paths. It was perceived, too, that while Hester never put forward even the humblest title to share in the world's privileges, further than to breathe the common ear and earn daily bread for little Pearl and herself by the faithful labor of her hands, she was quick to acknowledge her sisterhood with the race of man whenever benefits were to be conferred. None so ready as she to give of her little substance to every demand of poverty, even though she, the bitter-hearted pauper, threw back a gibe in requital of the food brought regularly to his door, or the garments wrought for him by the fingers that could have embroidered a monarch's robe, or whatever the material had all been broken. Hence was the iron link of mutual crime, which neither he nor she could break. Like all other ties, it brought along with it its obligations. Hester Prynne did not now occupy precisely the same position in which we beheld her during the earlier periods of her ignominy. Years had come and gone. And Pearl was now 7 years old. Her mother, with the Scarlet Letter on her breast, glittering in its fantastic embroidery, had long been a familiar object to the townspeople, as is apt to be the case with a person that stands out in any prominence before the community, and at the same time interferes neither with the public nor individual interests and convenience. A species of general regard had ultimately grown up in reference to Hester Prynne. It is to the credit of human nature that, except where its selfishness is brought into play, it loves more readily than it hates. Hatred, by a gradual and quiet process, will even be transformed to love unless the change be impeded by a continually new irritation of the original feeling of hostility. In this matter of Hester Prynne, there was neither irritation nor irksomeness. She never battled with the public, but submitted uncomplainingly to its worst usage. She made no claim upon it in requital for what she suffered. She did not weigh upon its sympathies. Then also the blameless purity of her life during all these years in which she had been set apart to infamy was reckoned largely in her favor, with nothing now to lose in the sight of mankind, and with no hope and seemingly no wish of gaining anything. It could only be a genuine regard for virtue that had brought back the poor wanderer to its paths. It was perceived that while Hester never put forward even the humblest title to share into the world's privileges, further than to breathe in the common air and earn daily bread for her little Pearl and herself by the faithful labor of her hands, she was quick to acknowledge her sisterhood with the race of man whenever benefits were to be conferred. None so ready as she to give of her little substance to every demand of poverty, even though the bitter-hearted pauper threw back a gibe in requital of the food brought regularly to his door, or the garments wrought for him by the fingers that could have embroidered a monarch's robe. None so self-devoted as Hester when pestilences stalked through the town. In all seasons of calamity, indeed, whether general or of individuals, the outcast of society at once found her place. She came not as a guest, but as a rightful inmate into the household that was darkened by trouble, as if its gloomy twilight were a medium in which she was entitled to hold intercourse with her fellow creatures. There glimmered the embroidered letter with comfort in its unearthly ray. Elsewhere, the token of sin, it was the taper of the sick chamber. It had even thrown its gleam in the sufferer's hard extremity across the verge of time. It had shown him where to set his foot while the light of earth was fast becoming dim, and ere the light of futurity could reach him. In such emergencies, Esther's nature showed itself warm and rich, a wellspring of human tenderness, unfailing to every real demand and inexhaustible by the largest. Her breast, with its badge of shame, was but the softer pillow for the head that needed one. She was self-ordained a sister of mercy, or we may rather say the world's heavy hand had so ordained her, when neither the world nor she looked forward to this result. The letter was the symbol of her calling. Such helpfulness was found in her, so much power to do, and power to sympathize, that many people refused to interpret the Scarlet A by its original signification. They said that it meant able. So strong it was Esther Prynne with a woman's strength. It was only the darkened house that could contain her. When sunshine came again, she was not there. Her shadow had faded across the threshold. The helpful inmate had departed without one backward glance to gather up on the meed of gratitude, if any were in the hearts of those whom she had served so zealously. Meeting them in the street, she never raised her head to receive their greeting if they were resolute and passed on. If they were resolute to accost her, she laid her finger on the Scarlet Letter and passed on. This might be pride, but was so like humility that it produced all the softening influence of the latter quality on the public mind. The public is despotic in its temper. It is capable of denying common justice when too strenuously demanded as a right, but quite as frequently it awards more than justice when the appeal is made as despots. Love, too, habit made entirely in its generosity, interpreting Esther Prynne's deportment as an appeal of this nature. Society was inclined to show its former victim a more benign countenance than she cared to be favored with, or perchance than she deserved. The rulers and the wise and learned men of the community were longer in acknowledging the influence of Esther's good qualities than the people. The prejudices which they shared in common with the latter were fortified in themselves by an iron framework of reasoning that made it a far tougher labor to expel them. Day by day, nevertheless, their sour and rigid wrinkles were relaxing into something which, in the due course of years, might grow to be an expression of almost benevolence. Thus it was with the men of rank on whom their eminent position imposed the guardianship of the public morals. Individuals in their private life, meanwhile, had quite forgiven Esther Prynne for her frailty. Nay, more, they have begun to look upon the Scarlet Letter as the token not of that one sin for which she had borne so long and dreary a penance, but of her many good deeds since. Do you see that woman with the embroidered badge? They would say to strangers, it is our Esther, the town's own Esther, who is so kind to the poor, so helpful to the sick, so comfortable to the afflicted. Then it is true, the propensity of human nature to tell the very worst of itself when embodied in the person of another would constrain them to whisper the black scandal of bygone years. It was none the less a fact, however, that in the eyes of the very men who spoke thus, the Scarlet Letter had the effect of the cross on a nun's bosom. It imparted to the wearer a kind of sacredness which enabled her to walk securely amid all peril. Had she fallen among thieves, it would have kept her safe. It was reported and believed by many that the native had drawn his arrow against the badge, and that the missile struck it but fell harmless to the ground. The effect of the symbol, or rather of the position in respect to society that was indicated by it on the mind of Esther Prynne herself, was powerful and peculiar. All the light and graceful foliage of her character had been withered up by this red-hot brand, and had long ago fallen away, leaving a bare and harsh outline which might have been repulsive. possessed friends or companions to be repelled by it. Even the attractiveness of her person had undergone a similar change. It might be partly owing to the studied austerity of her dress, and partly to the lack of demonstration in her manners. It was a sad transformation, too, that her rich and luxuriant hair had either been cut off or was so completely hidden by a cap that not a shining lock of it ever once flushed into sunshine. It was due in part to all these causes, but still more to something else, that there seemed to be no longer anything in Esther's face. It was due in part to all these causes, but still more to something else, that there seemed to be no longer anything in Esther's face for love to dwell upon, nothing in Esther's form, though majestic and statue-like, that passion would ever dream of chasing in its embrace, nothing in Esther's bosom to make it ever again the pillow of affection. Some attribute had departed from her, the permanence of which had been essential to keep her a woman. Such is frequently the fate and such the stern development of the feminine character and person when the woman has encountered and lived through an experience of peculiar severity. If she survive, the tenderness will either be crushed out of her, and the outward semblance is the same, crushed so more deeply into her heart that it can never show itself more. The latter is perhaps the truest theory. She who has once been woman and ceased to be so might at any moment become a woman again if there were only the magic touch to effect the transfiguration. We shall see whether Esther Prynne were ever afterwards so touched and so transfigured. Much of the marble coldness of Esther's impression was to be attributed to the circumstances that her life had turned in a great measure from passion and feeling to thought. Standing alone in the world, alone as to any dependence on society, and with little pearl to be guided and protected, alone and hopeless of retrieving her position, even had she not scorned to consider it desirable, she cast away the fragments of a broken chain. The world's law was no law for her mind. It was an age in which the human intellect, newly emancipated, had taken a more active and a wider range than for many centuries before. Men of the sword had overthrown nobles and kings. Men bolder than these had overthrown and rearranged, not actually, but within the sphere of theory, which was their most real abode. The whole system of ancient prejudice wherewith was linked much of ancient principle. Esther Prynne imbibed the spirit. She assumed a freedom of speculation then common enough on the other side of the Atlantic, but which our forefathers, had they known, it would have held to be a deadlier crime than that stigmatized by the Scarlet Letter. In her lonesome cottage by the seashore, thoughts visited her, such as dared to enter no other dwelling in New England. Shadowy guests that would have been as perilous as demons to their entertainer. Could they have been seen with so much as knocking at her door? It is remarkable that persons who speculate the most boldly often conform with the most perfect quietude to the external regulations of society. The thought suffices them without investing itself in the flesh and blood of action. So it seemed to be with Esther, yet had little Pearl never come to her from the spiritual world, it might have been far otherwise. Then she might have come down to us in history hand in hand with Anna Hutchison as the foundress of a religious sect. She might, in one of her phases, have been a prophetess. She might, and not improbably, would have suffered death from the stern tribunals of the period for attempting to undermine the foundations of the Puritan establishment. But in the education of her child, the mother's enthusiasm of thought had something to wreak itself upon Providence in the person of this little girl. Had assigned to Esther a charge, the germ and blossom and womanhood, to be cherished and developed amid the hosts of difficulties. Everything was against her. The world was hostile. The child's of nature had something wrong in it. goodness of heart, whether it were for ill or good that the poor little creature had been born at all. Indeed, the same dark question rose into her mind with reference to the whole race of womanhood. Was existence worth accepting even to the happiest among them? As concerned her own individual existence, she had long ago decided in the negative and dismissed the point as settled. A tendency to speculation, though it may keep woman quiet as it does man, yet makes her sad. She discerns it may be such a hopeless task before her. As a first step, the whole system of society is to be torn down and built up anew. Then the very nature of the opposite sex, or its long hereditary habit, which has become like nature, it is to be essentially modified before woman can be allowed to assume what seems a fair and suitable passion. Finally, all other difficulties being obviated, a woman cannot take advantage of these preliminary reforms until she herself shall have undergone a still mightier change, in which perhaps the ethereal essence wherein she has her truest life will be found to have evaporated. A woman never overcomes these problems by any exercise of thought. They are not to be solved, or only in one way. If her heart chance to come uppermost, they vanish. Thus Hester Prynne, whose heart had lost its regular and healthy throb, wandered without a clue in the dark labyrinth of mind, now turned aside by an insurmountable precipice, and now starting back from a deep chasm. There was wild and ghastly scenery all around her, and home and comfort nowhere. At times a fearful doubt strove to possess her soul, whether it were not better to send Pearl at once to heaven, and go herself to such futurity as eternal justice should provide. The Scarlet Letter had not done its office. Now, however, her interview with the Reverend Mr. Dimsdale on the night of his vigil had given her a new theme of reflection, and held up to her an object that appeared worthy of any exertion and sacrifice for its attainment. She had witnessed the intense misery beneath which the minister struggled, or to speak more accurately, had ceased to struggle. She saw that he stood on the verge of lunacy, if he had not already stepped across it. It was impossible to doubt that, whatever painful efficacy there might be in the secret sting of remorse, a deadlier venom had been infused into it by the hand that proffered relief. A secret enemy had been continually by his side under the semblance of a friend and helper, and had availed himself of the opportunities thus afforded for tampering with the delicate springs of Mr. Dimsdale. Mr. Dimsdale's nature, Hester could not but ask herself whether there had not originally been a defect of truth, courage, and loyalty on her own part in allowing the minister to be thrown into a position where so much evil was to be foreboded and nothing auspicious to be hoped. Her only justification lay in the fact that she had been able to discern no method of rescuing him from a blacker ruin than had overwhelmed herself, except by acquiescing in Roger Chillingworth's scheme of disguise. Under that impulse, she had made her choice and had chosen, as it now appeared to the more wretched alternative of the two. She determined to redeem her error so far as it might yet be possible. Strengthened by years of hard and solemn trial, she felt herself no longer so inadequate to cope with Roger Chillingworth as on that night, abased by sin and half maddened by the ignominy that was still new when they had talked together in the prison chamber. She had climbed her way since then to a higher point. The old man, on the other hand, had brought himself nearer to her level, or perhaps below it by the revenge which he had stooped for. In fine, Hester Prynne resolved to meet her former husband and do what might be in her power for the rescue of the victim, on whom he had so evidently set his gripe. The occasion was not long to seek. One afternoon, walking with Pearl in a retired part of the peninsula, she beheld the old physician with a basket on one arm and a staff in the other hand, stooping along the ground in quest of roots and herbs to concoct his medicines withal. Okay, so that was chapters 9 through